Welcome back to class, everybody. This is the second lecture for kinesiology. I posted the first lecture already online. There's a link to it under module 1. So if you need to catch up on things, feel free to do so. The other thing is if you don't have the exact course textbook that I have suggested in the syllabus, I think pretty much any kinesiology book on the planet would work. Usually human muscles and Newton's laws and a lot of the concepts that we're going over, they haven't changed for a number of years. So if you had any kinesiology textbook as a resource, you could probably go to the index and find the topic that we're talking about, and I'm sure that it would be more than reasonable. I'll try to make sure that I keep scanning and posting as much of the chapters that I think are relevant, but if you had another textbook or whatever, I'm sure it would probably work just fine. I also hope that the class is as straightforward as possible, so if you pay attention to the lectures and you listen to them over again and watch the and take a look at the PowerPoint presentations, it should, I think, be self-explanatory. So. Does anybody have any questions before we start? No? I think the easiest thing for me to do is a screen share, because then I can use all my annotation things and you can see my my mouse here, so I can, I think, make it a little bit more of a dynamic lecture if I do it that way. So let's just open this up and get going. All right, so the first class, what we did is we talked about Newton's laws. Isaac Newton came up with 3 laws, of actually 4 laws of motion, but we really only are focusing on the first 3 laws of motion. So we'll go quickly through those one more time just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And then what we have to do is go into kinematics and kinetics. And kinematics is more a descriptive method to talk about how a body is moving through space, and kinetics is more about what part of the body is, or specific aspects within the human body that are allowing for those movements through space to occur. So kinematics you could think of as is the description of, say for instance, a car is moving down the road. You would have to use the words velocity, acceleration, the miles that the car traveled. But then, and those would be all like sort of the synonym or the metaphorical kinematic terms. And then kinetics is all about how many horsepower the car has and how much torque the engine has. So kinetics is more talking about the aspects of the human body that are driving the body forward so that the kinematics can occur. So we'll get into all that stuff today. And then we'll probably have to identify other aspects of descriptions so that we can talk about movement differently. So kinesiology is the science or the study of movement. And we're going to have to be able to describe movement differently than maybe we did before. Like if you watch Michael Jordan in The Last Dance, you might be like, yo, that's nasty. Or, wow, that was an amazing three-pointer, or you might look at his shirt or something. But when we're describing movement in this class, we're going to have to use more kinesiologically relevant terms, such as, your cardinal planes of motion, anterior, posterior, inferior, superior, things like that. And we're going to have to also use things like torque and moments and stuff. So there are some definitions we're going to have to get into. We will define torque because for the most part, your muscles are creating torques. And what a torque does is it creates a rotation. When I lift my arm up, usually my arm rotates. It doesn't translate straight up and down. It rotates because there's an axis of rotation, and my joints create axes of rotation. So you can see like my forearm rotates. And if it rotates, that means it's a result of some type of torque. So we have to define torque. Then we'll get into the types of lever systems that are in the human body, and levers are pretty cool because they give us mechanical advantage. And when you have mechanical advantage, you can achieve um, activities that may require more strength or constant strength, and make it so that you're a little bit more efficient. And then we'll have to learn how to add vectors together, because vectors are symbolic of forces, and your muscles provide a force. So you can use vectors to kind of describe human motion and maybe potential problems in human motion. So those are the things that we'll try to accomplish today. As a quick review, Newton's first law is the law of inertia or momentum, and momentum is mass times velocity. So the faster an object is moving, the more momentum it'll have, and the more difficult it'll be to stop it. Or if the velocity is 0 and the object is quite massive, it'll require a larger force to get that mass to move. So an object in its particular state of motion tends to want to stay in that particular state of motion unless it's perturbed by something, and that perturbation might have to be more forceful if it's more massive or if it's moving fast. Newton's second law is the law of mass and acceleration. Forces cause masses to accelerate. And typically mass will accelerate in the direction of the force applied to it. So if I push on a mass, that mass is going to increase in velocity. That's the definition of acceleration, a change in velocity over time. So it might go from 0 velocity to velocity of 5 miles per hour. And if that's the case, the change from 0 to 5 miles per hour implies that there's an acceleration. So forces cause masses to accelerate or to go from one state to another. And what's interesting about that is that your muscles are unique in the sense that they're a tissue in the human body that can actually create a force. And you might have heard of the sliding filament theory. I'm sure you guys have heard of that before. Now, whether or not I believe in the sliding filament theory, or the sliding filament theory is rooted in fact, or whether or not it's theoretical, is something that we'll get into. But in any event, Newton's second law is force is equal to mass times acceleration. And then the third law that we're going to be talking about this semester is every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's one of the reasons why your body can remain supported by your legs. So one of the reasons why a cane works. It's one of the reasons why you're able to jump when you push into the ground and your muscles create a force and push into the ground. The ground also pushes back on you, and that's what helps assist you when you're jumping. But if the ground can't provide a force, like you're standing on water, then you can't jump off of water. You sink in water because the ground kind of disperses your weight and moves away from the force that's coming on it. So we'll talk about Newton's third law as well. I don't think we necessarily need to go into all of those things in incredible detail. We will later on when we're talking about the hip and the knee and stuff like that. And then Newton's fourth law is the law of gravitation. It has to do with stars and planets and stuff. So I don't think it's necessarily immediately relevant to what we're talking about now. So we're just going to kind of move on from it. All right. Does anybody have any questions thus far? All right. We talked about different types of motion. There's translation and rotation. Translation is when all of the points on an object move the same distance and direction. In that case, you could have rectilinear or straight line translation, or you could also have curvilinear translation. And I would say that as your body, say for instance, you're jumping from one point to another, or you're sliding across the table, those would be examples of translation. But for the most part, when you use your muscles and you create forces, your limbs don't translate. When I fire my quadricep, my leg doesn't translate. It rotates. It rotates around my hip joint, my acetabulum. So rotations are unique because, or movement in the human body rather is, I think we're going to probably describe it as rotations. And rotations are when all the points on a particular object move the same angular distance, or the same angle, but a different total like arc distance. So if I move my arm like this, or if somebody, if I move my arm like this, my hand is translating or is curvilinear translating over a greater arc than, say, for instance, a point closer to the axis of rotation. All right, so the distance each point is traveling might be different, but the angular distance is the same. So that would be rotation. And a lot of movement that we do is a combination of translation and rotation. So I'm pretty sure. And then we also talked about active and passive movement. Active movements are movements that are created by your muscles or that are initiated by muscle activity. And passive movements are movements that occur because of some type of external force like gravity or somebody pushing you or wind or falling or something like that. So those are all sources of, or different types of movement, but created, and the forces are generated by different providers. So when you're using your muscles, that's called an active force or an active movement. And when something else is acting on you, it's an external source of force. So, and these will, in some manners, they'll tie into potential for injury, especially at the muscle and tendon level. So, for instance, like let's say I'm sliding into second base, or I'm rounding first base and I'm about to hit my foot on the corner of the base. Usually, so that you don't clip your toe on the base, your foot is going to be in flexion. And if your foot is in flexion, it means that your calf muscle is going to be tight. All right, so you have an isometric contraction in your calf muscle, which is your active muscle force. But then when you hit the base, your foot is going to be pushed by the base, and that's an active, that's an external force. So I have an active contraction of the muscle, and that muscle is stiff because of that. And something that's stiff doesn't want to change length. So if the muscle is contracted isometrically, and then I slide into second base, and that base is going to force my foot into even more dorsiflexion, all right, then the active muscle is already contracted, not wanting to change length. The only thing that's going to change length in that case is the tendon that's attached to it. So typically, you could also think of the same thing if I'm doing like a bicep curl. All right, my bicep is firing concentrically in order to lift the weight, but my weight is pulling down against that with the force of gravity, and that would be a large external force. So when you couple active forces with passive forces and the muscle gets stiffer, typically that's going to put all of the tension on a tendon. And that's potentially a way that tendon injuries can occur. We're going to start talking about the difference between muscle, tendon, and ligament. And they're actually structured very differently in terms of the collagen and elastin fibers because they take forces from many different directions. Typically, a tendon is going to be attached to your muscle, and a muscle only contracts in one plane. So all of the little elastin and collagen fibers in tendon is going to be lined up in that one plane, in that one direction, the direction that the muscle pulls. But your ligaments in your knees are going to take rotation, tension, bending forces, external like kicking and all sorts of different angles that they have to dissipate force. So a ligament is going to be structured much different than a tendon is. And because the structure is different, the mechanism for injury is going to be different. So we're going to use stress strain curves, and I'll show you a little bit more about that when we get into connective tissue. But typically a muscle tendinous unit is going to experience injury or strain when there's an active muscle contraction coupled by an external source of force. And when that external source of force reaches a particular threshold, then that tendon has got to do something. All right, and typically you'll hear that ligaments tear and tendons rupture. There's a difference between those terms, and we'll try to like talk a little bit more about how active and passive muscle contractions and forces can or relate to tendon and muscle injury and stuff. So anyway, we'll get to that later. So kinematics is deals with how things move through time. It's a way of describing motion. And right now we can't describe motion with like terms like, ooh, that was flashy, or that was awesome, we have to use more technical terms to start describing movement and motion. And you're going to use terms like um, mass, acceleration, displacement, miles traveled. So we're going to be using things that that will describe change in position. You can use vectors. You can use all sorts of things. You can use acceleration here. This Newton's second law is a description of motion. All right, and we're going to get these through observation. We're going to get kinematic variables through observation, and you can use observation like video motion capture and things like that. And you're going to come up with terms like length or time or velocity or acceleration or some type of combination of length and time. All right, so you have meters per second would be velocity. Now mass is more associated with kinetics, but these would all be descriptive terms that are kinematic descriptive terms. Now, what they are is they're describing the motion of the body once the motion's already occurring, but it's not describing the motions within the body that are making these kinematic variables change. So it's a description of the motion itself, not a description of the engine of the body that's creating those motions. So that's the big difference between kinematics and kinetics. Kinetics is more of an internal description, and kinematics is more of an external description. So there are other terms that we'll have to start to use to describe kinematics as well, like our anterior, posterior, close to the midline, superior, inferior. Those are all kinematic terms that are, again, used to describe motion. But we could say things like, instead of anterior and posterior, we could say things like front to back. All right, but right now, like if I was to turn around, all right, my front is now towards the wall behind me and my back is towards you. But if I turn this way, then my front is towards you and my back is away. So front and back, those things are like, they're relevant, they're relative to my positioning and relative to the observer. But my anterior is right here. And if I turn around, it's still my anterior. This is the anterior of my face, and now this is the posterior, regardless of whether or not I'm facing you or not. So anterior, posterior, those are not relevant terms. Those are absolute terms used to describe the actual the positioning of my body relevant to me, not relative to an observer. So for instance, if I tip upside down and do a handstand, all right, my head is still going to be superior to my body. All right, it's just my orientation might be changed, but I'm still going to be posterior, inferior. Those things don't change. They're not relative terms. So in terms of anterior and posterior, that's relative to the front of the body here, and posterior is the back. All right, you have a posterior arm and an anterior arm. Posterior chest, where your pectoralis muscles are going to be, and your posterior is going to be where your rotator cuff muscles are going to be. All right, so there's anterior, posterior. There's midline, which is medial and lateral. So medial is more close to the midline, and lateral is further away from the center of the body. You have posterior and inferior. Superior and inferior. Superior is closer to the head, and inferior is further away from the head. Proximal and distal is closer to the origin, and distal is further away from the origin. Cephalad and caudal. I remember caudal because caudal equina is the thing at the bottom of your spine that opens up like and caudal equina means the horse's tail. So I remember caudal is like tail. It's at the bottom of the body, and cephalad is closer to the head. And superficial is more towards the outside of the skin, and invasive or whatever is closer to the inside of the skin. So these are all, again, just descriptive terms that we're going to have to use in order to talk about locations of origin, insertion, action, and also talk about the actions that the muscles are creating. There's another way of just visualizing each of these, right? Let's see if I can pull this up a little bit. All right. So if your visual and superior is closer to the head, and proximal is also closer to the joint. This is and this is distal is further away from the head. Posterior is towards the dorsal side or the back. Anterior is toward the ventral side. Anyway, take a look at these terms. I'm sure that I'm sure you guys have experience with these terms, but these are all kinematic terms used to describe the body. We have planes of motion. We'll talk about movement in the sagittal plane versus movement in the horizontal plane. The sagittal plane, the way that I remember it is that sagittal sounds like the word sad, and tears go up and down, so it's an up and down plane. Here's another up and down plane that divides the front and the back. So the sagittal plane is the only other plane that there is that's vertical, which would be left and right. So the sagittal plane separates the body from left and right, and the frontal plane separates the body from forward to backward. Motions that occur in the sagittal plane are flexion and extension motions, and motions that occur in the frontal plane are going to be abduction and adduction terms. And horizontal plane is the plane that divides the body, typically horizontal to the ground. And you're going to have a lot of rotational terms that are going to occur in the transverse or the horizontal plane. All right. Typically, flexion and extension are going to occur in the sagittal plane. And flexion extension typically will be motions that occur against gravity, right? You're contracting in a concentric contraction against gravity, or you're extending to absorb gravity. And we'll talk about different muscle contractions that create and absorb power. But flexion and extension will typically occur in the sagittal plane. Abduction and adduction in the frontal plane, and rotational movements are typically going to be in the horizontal plane. Now, circumduction is like a motion like this. I'm sure that you guys can see me if you look over at the. This would be typically circumduction. It's a curvilinear, so your body is rotating in or translating. So all of the points in the object are going the same angular distance and the same direction. This would be a rotation, but this is a curvilinear translation. So when you lift your arms above your head in abduction, typically what will happen is your scapula will circumduct. So there's circumduction of your scapula. There's also protraction and retraction. If I go like this and I go like that with my arms, I move them anteriorly, and then I also rotate my arms posteriorly, you're going to have a protraction. Your scapula are going to protract, and then I can pull my scapula back towards the midline of my back when I'm doing my scap raises or I'm doing my rotator cuff strength. All right, that's all going to be scapular retraction. If you're trying to do a stable handstand, what you want to do is you want to protract your scapula around your back. And what that does is it locks your scapula against your rib cage and makes it for a much more stable structure. So we work protraction and retraction strength exercises with my gymnasts all the time, and a lot of rotator cuff stabilization exercises, like when you're doing your farmer carries, you got to keep your shoulder blades tight in the back. When you do your I don't know, you do those circles against the wall like this and up and down, and you're trying to retract your scapula and reset the neutral positioning of your scapula so that you can increase your rotator cuff strength. A lot of the work we do with my guys in our strength and conditioning exercises are retraction exercises. And then you have horizontal abduction, and adduction would be if your arms are flat out horizontal to the ground. This would be horizontal abduction, and this is horizontal adduction. And the way that you can tell the difference between abduction and adduction is adduction, ADD, is like adding a limb to the midline of your body. So when your hands come closer together, they're going towards the midline, so that would be adduction. And when your arms are going away, that would be like the opposite, that's abduction. When your arms are going closer towards your midline, but your hands are in the frontal plane, that would also be adduction. And when your arms are raising away from your body, that would be abduction. And we'll talk about those terms as well later on as we talk about shoulder movements and all sorts of stuff like that. So those would all again, be kinematic terms of, and ways to describe human movement aside from just, you know, being observational. That guy moved really awesome, or we have to kind of use more relevant terms these days. So these would all be kinematic terms. Pronation and supination. This is supination with my hand. All right, and this is pronation. All right, when you supinate, you can either supinate your hand or your foot. The way to remember that is like when my hand is supinated, I can hold a cup of soup. And if it's pronated, the soup would drop out of my hand onto the ground. So that's supination. This is pronation. It can also be relevant in terms of foot mechanics, but in foot mechanics, it's going to be more, I guess the term that we're more familiar with is going to be inversion and eversion. But I'm sure that people have heard of the term hyperpronation when you're talking about foot mechanics, and we're going to talk about that a lot. And we're going to talk about certain things that you can wear on your feet, shoes, Uggs, Vans, flip-flops, and things like that that might promote more or less pronation. And your foot is supposed to hit the ground 10,000 times per day. And if the foot hits the ground 10,000 times per day incorrectly, and the foot is attached to your shin, and your shin is attached to your femur, and your femur is attached to your femoral head and your femoral neck, and that all is interacting in your acetabulum, and the acetabulum is going to drive the motion of your hips. We could have issues all the way up the chain in terms of dissipating force if the feet aren't interacting with the ground effectively, if they're hyperpronating. Hyper means too much pronation. And that could be a mechanism for injury associated with the kneecap, or Osgood-Schlatter's disease, or hip pain, or lower back injury, or even all the way up the chain to potential sources of migraines. So later on, when we talk about the foot, we'll talk about pronation and how that relates to potential knee pain and poor patella tracking. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsi is like a dorsal fin is the back fin of a shark. So dorsiflexion is when your foot is flexing towards the towards like it's the ceiling. Well, it's when it's flexing towards the top surface of the foot. And plantar flexion is when your foot is pointing. So, I mean, I think that's the easiest way to describe those two. Now, when your tibialis anterior functions, your tibialis anterior fires concentrically to create dorsiflexion, but it also fires eccentrically to slow down plantar flexion. Typically, when people have problems with shin splints, it's associated with the strength of the anterior tib, or the tibialis anterior muscle, to fire strong enough eccentrically to absorb the force as the heel hits the ground, and the ground reaction force forces the foot into plantar flexion. If the foot forces into plantar flexion and the anterior tib isn't strong enough eccentrically to overcome that force 10,000 times a day, or even more, and even with more force, if somebody's running on track or something like that, that could be a potential mechanism for injury. You have the torque creating an external source of movement, an external force, and you have the tibialis anterior firing actively eccentrically, but it's not strong enough to do so. So there is a combination of your active and passive forces that could combine to create some type of musculotendinous injury. So then we have radial and ulnar deviation. That's when you have your hand like this and you flip your hand over. And right now your radius and your ulna are both right next to each other. And as I flip my hand over, they like crisscross over each other. That's when you internally and externally rotate your wrist. An easy way to remember the radial side versus the ulnar side is radius has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 letters in it. All right, and ulnar has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters in it. So because radial has more letters, I always remember that it's on the bigger finger side. So the radius is towards the thumb, and the ulnar side is the pinky side. And I just remember that because more and less letters. So the ulnar, the word has less letters, therefore it's on the pinky side. Inversion and eversion is when the sole of the foot faces in or faces out. It's the same thing as pronation and supination. For the most part, when you like sit down on a chair and you can't reach the ground, most people's feet are going to hang in slight inversion. And that's why when you look at the number of sprains, eversion versus inversion sprains, the number of inversion sprains is much higher than the number of eversion sprains, because when you invert, the lateral aspect of your foot is more likely to hit the ground first. All right, and most people's feet like hang slightly inverted, so it forces more contact of the lateral side of the foot, and that could potentially result in more sprains towards that side. So there's inversion and eversion of the foot, and these are all just terms that we're going to have to start to use to describe motion. The description of motion as it's occurring is kinematics, all right? But then we have things that are different than that. We have kinetics, and kinetics is the relationship between the forces that the muscles are producing and that the limbs are forced to go through, because those forces are acting at axes of rotation, your joints. So you have internal forces, which is your muscle contraction, but then there's also passive forces, like your tendon and your muscles. If I took them out of your body and I removed your bicep and I hung your bicep from the ceiling and I pulled on it, it would create a tension. There would be a tension in the tissue itself. All right, your tendons and your muscles can create passive tension. They're also like somewhat elastic. And like an elastic band or something like this, I can store energy in an elastic, and then I can use that energy and fling it to create movement. So there's not only can your muscles, can they provide an active force by allowing the actin and myosin to interact, but you can also have a passive tension, a passive force. And elastic potential is a tensile force that your muscles, tendons, and ligaments can all somewhat provide. So when we talk about internal forces, we're going to be talking about active muscle contractions, but also the ability for your tissues to store elastic energy. And then there's also external forces that may result in kinetic movements, like if I lift my arm up and I just release my muscles and my shoulders of all the tension, my arm is going to create, there is going to go through a rotation, but that rotation is caused by gravity or some other force outside of the body. When we talk about kinetics, we're going to have to talk about the term torque, because for the most part, your body doesn't translate. Your limbs don't translate. They rotate. And usually a straight force is going to result in a translation, but a torque is going to result in a rotation. Let me just see what we have over here. All right, so here, a torque is a force which is going to be produced by a muscle, in this case, multiplied by the distance that that muscle is acting away from the axis of rotation. The greater the distance, the more torque you can provide. That's why usually a pipe wrenches, that red wrench that plumbers use, is really long. Or if you want to hit a 300-yard drive, you're not going to do it with a 9-iron that's pretty short. You're going to do a driver. And the driver is much longer. It has a greater distance, and the head of the driver is further away from the axis of rotation, which is your hands, your wrist, or even your lower back, which is creating some type of twisting motion. All right. Or if you want to increase the torque or the amount of work that your body is doing, say for instance on a leg raise, and you're working with somebody who's an older individual, you could put the weight cuff at the knee. And if that's the case, then the weight cuff is positioned at a particular distance away from the hip flexor muscles. Or you could move the weight cuff to the ankle, and by increasing the distance away from the axis of rotation, you're increasing the torque and the amount that the muscle has to work, but you're not necessarily increasing the weight of the weight cuff. So if I have a 5-pound weight cuff at the knee and I move it to the ankle, it's going to make it so that there's more torque around the ankle, around the hip joint, so that that person's going to have to work harder. When my mom started lifting a couple of years ago, she thought that, well, it's only 5 pounds, it's only 5 pounds. And I kept asking her, are you aware of the term torque? And she didn't really understand what I was talking about. And she ended up kind of creating an injury to her sternoclavicular joint here when she was bench pressing. Because when you bench press, the weight of the bench is at your hand, but your hand is a distance away from the axis of rotation. Created a lot of torque. She thought that it was only 10 pounds that she was lifting, and I asked her to talk to her personal trainer about the term torque, and they didn't. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, she's like, my neck hurts, and she has this big dislocation of her SC joint. And I just don't think that she understood the difference between, say, for instance, holding a barbell with your hands wide versus your hands close. So it caused a little bit of pain. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit about torque. And here's another example of that term, all right? So when you're talking about torque, there's a distance here. And the distance that we're talking about is a lever arm. So this is just a schematic or a model of your arm. This is your humerus, this is your elbow, and this is your radius and ulna. And attached to that, you have a bicep. And the bicep is not attached at the elbow. The bicep is attached more distal than the elbow. All right, it might not be a very long distance between your insertion point of your bicep tendon on your forearm to the elbow, but there is a distance there. And you can even like feel your bicep tendon. It's not right in the elbow joint. And because your bicep tendon attaches more distal than the joint, there's a distance here called the lever arm. And the lever arm is defined as the distance that that force is actually being generated through. All right, it's the distance from the axis of rotation to the line of action of the force. Now, the bicep is also going to be attached to your shoulder here. So the bicep isn't pulling straight up and down. The bicep is pulling at a particular angle, all right? And then you can say, for instance, this is the actual direction that the bicep is pulling, but the bicep is pulling some in a vertical direction and some in a horizontal direction. In any event, this is the angle at which the bicep tendon is pulling. So this is a muscular force, all right? And that force is acting at a particular distance. And because of that, when you move your arm, the humerus and the radius and the ulna, it doesn't translate upwards, all right? What it does is it rotates, all right? And that rotation is caused by a force acting at a particular distance away from the axis of rotation. When the bicep fires, what it does is it creates this rotation of your forearm, right? The very fact that your muscles are firing at a distance away from the axis of rotation is why you rotate, why your arm rotates. I don't think that I've ever thought about rotating my arm. I've never thought, when my bicep fires right now, I have to rotate my arm. That's not a decision that the brain makes. All right, your arm rotates simply because your bicep tendon is not attached at the elbow joint. It's attached at a distance away from the elbow, and therefore it's creating a muscular internal force at a distance away from the axis of rotation. That's why every time your bicep fires, it creates a rotation. That's not like a cognitive action that your brain makes. That's something that's more associated with the physics and the structure of your body. All right, so a moment arm is a little bit different than the lever arm. The lever arm is straight this distance right here from where the axis of rotation is to where the force is applied. A moment arm, though, is different than that. If you notice here, right here is going to be the lever arm, all right? And the moment arm is going to be a perpendicular distance. See, there's a right angle here. And it's the perpendicular distance between your moment arm and the muscular force. So I think that if I have this here. So right now, here is the lever arm associated with the bicep tendon. That's the lever arm. But the moment arm it's actually going to be pretty close because it's 90 degrees. But imagine if I took this arm and I extended his arm all the way down. The lever arm wouldn't change. The lever arm is a fixed length. It's never going to change. The only reason that the lever arm would change is if I rupture the bicep tendon here. And the bicep tendon, or I could take the bicep tendon and through surgery, I could move it over here. And if that's the case, the lever arm would change. All right, but if I took this, right now, the moment arm is pretty much the same as the lever arm because it's 90 degrees. But imagine if I took the hand and I extended the arm all the way down. The lever arm would still be the same length, but the moment arm would be much smaller. I think I have a couple of, pictures of that later on. If I take this blue line and I extended the blue line all the way down so that the forearm is vertical and the humerus is vertical, then the moment arm would actually be 0. It would get smaller and smaller and smaller. And the biggest the moment arm is going to be is if the arm is at 90 degrees. All right. So when the moment arm is 0, and it's really the moment arm that we're talking about in terms of this distance here, we're going to talk about the moment arm. And maybe what I'll do is next class, I'll just give you a better picture of it. Or maybe I can even do it like this. Hold on. Maybe I can do it like this. I'll stop the share for a second. And I'll just show you. So right now, if my arm is straight, and one of the reasons why you don't grab and hold on to something with your arm straight like this, or with your arm completely extended like that, right? If Zach is going to throw something at me, I'm going to catch it like this. I'm going to catch it 90 degrees. Why? Because my brain is telling me to catch it 90 degrees. Is that a cognitive action? Because if I just threw it at you and you didn't know what I was doing, most likely you would organize your body to catch something like that. That's how we do it. Well, there's a couple of different reasons. The first reason is associated with torque. All right, if I catch it out here, then this is the axis of rotation for my shoulder, and my arm is the length. So if I catch it with my arm straight, there's just a huge torque associated with whatever weight I'm catching in my hand. And because there's a large torque, it's going to mean that my shoulder muscles have to work way too hard to balance that weight. So if I catch something a little bit closer, now the torque associated with this object is much less because now this is the distance here, as opposed to the distance including the length of my upper arm. So catching things closer to you, or spotting somebody closer to you, or doing a bed transfer as a nurse with your client closer to you is going to reduce the overall torque and reduce the overall work that your muscle is going to have to do in order to catch or move or support that particular weight. But the other thing is right now, the moment arm associated with my bicep is as big as it can be. And if I extend my arm all the way, now there is no moment arm, all right? The moment arm is much smaller. So when the moment arm, and I'll show you, and I'll show you like another picture or another slide that will explain this a little bit better the next time we're online, all right? But if my arm is fully extended, also, the moment arm associated with my bicep is almost nil, all right? So if the moment arm associated with my bicep gets smaller and smaller and smaller, then the amount of force that my bicep has to produce is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So in this example here, if the distance associated with the moment arm is like 0 or close to 0, then the amount of force that my muscle has to produce to overcome that torque has to go higher and higher and higher. Right? The smaller the distance, the higher the force. So right here, when my arm is at 90 degrees, the moment arm associated with the axis of rotation and the line of pull of the bicep is as big as it can be. And therefore, if I catch something at 90 degrees, the force of my bicep doesn't have to be as much because the moment arm associated with the bicep tendon is higher. All right, so it's a way to take advantage of the fact that, number one, the total torque associated with the object is closer because this distance here is smaller, but the moment arm is like you have a maximum advantage by putting your arm at 90 degrees because the moment arm is going to be bigger. All right, so there's torque is going to be something that we talk about pretty often in terms of the overall work and forces that your muscles are going to have to produce in order to overcome external forces. All right, but I think that what I'll do is I'll hold off on that and make a good slide for you so you can understand how the moment arm is changing as the muscle is extending. And just give me a class to do that, and I'll show you. I think we have a little bit of time left, so 50 minutes goes by really quick. We'll probably just get to these lever systems and have to do the rest later anyway. So one cool thing about your bones is your bones are solid. And because they're solid, they can create like a lever. And a lever is something like a solid object that you can use for leverage. And you have, and leverage is something that you can gain a mechanical advantage using. All right, so I'll explain that a little bit. There are different types of levers that you can utilize, or that your body utilizes, or that are present in physics. All right, the first kind of lever is a first class lever, where I have a force on one side of the axis of rotation, and then there's a resistance force. So force here, we're gonna like call muscle force, and a resistance force is an external force that's created by gravity. So I'll show you an example of a first class lever. All right, your skull rests on your head. Your skull rather rests on your axis joint right here. Now, I don't recall really walking through life thinking about balancing my head on my shoulders. In fact, I've never thought of it before, ever. And your head is actually pretty heavy. So how does it achieve this balance? And if your head is, I don't know, 15 pounds, why don't I ever get tired holding 15 pounds on the top of my body all day, every day? Why don't I ever think of it, and why don't I ever get tired of doing it? Well, it's because you have a lever. You have an axis of rotation right here at the base of your skull. All right, and then on one side of the axis of rotation here, you have your neck extensor muscles, and they're pulling down in this direction. They're pulling downwards. All right, so they're pulling down. And then in the front of your face, you have the mass of your cheekbones and your jaw and your mandible and your nose and all the bones that are in the front of your face. So this mass right here is creating a downward force. This downward force that's acting pretty much along this line here, this right here is creating a torque. There's the axis of rotation here. The weight or the mass of your face is pulling downwards in this direction. And because there's a distance away from the axis of rotation, it's creating a torque that's getting the head and making the head want to rotate in this direction. All right, and let's see if I can do this. It's making the face and head want to rotate in this direction. But the neck extensor muscles here are firing downwards. The neck muscles are firing here. Here's an axis of rotation there. So here's this force that's creating a rotation in that direction. So the weight of your head is creating a rotation in that direction. The muscles are creating a rotation in that direction. And pretty much what they're doing is they're creating a first class lever system, like a seesaw, where your neck extensor muscles are pulling in this direction and the weight of your face is pulling in this direction. And if they're both working at the same force or the same amount of torque, because they're the same distance away from the axis of rotation, and that distance and the force provided by each of those is creating the same torque, then you're establishing balance here. So the reason why you don't have to think so much about the head on top of your body is because your head is balanced. Your head is balanced by an equal and opposite torque. One torque created by your neck extensor muscles, and the other torque created externally by the passive weight of your cheekbones and mandible and face and stuff. So what happens is, and the reason you don't have to think too much about how your head maintains its balance at the top of your body is because there's a first class lever system there. And the benefit of a first class lever system is balance. Now, if, say, for instance, your neck extensor muscles are not strong enough to create that balance, then you're going to have a forward tilt of your skull, and that could potentially put too much tension on these muscles, which could potentially lead to neck pain and all sorts of other things as well. But the reason why you don't necessarily have to think too much about how your head is balancing on your shoulders is because you've created a first class, or the structure of your body creates a first class lever system, and the benefit of a first class lever system is balance. All right, now there's other types of lever systems. Let's get rid of this guy here. Let's get rid of that. I don't know how to get rid of that, so I'll just move it over. Get rid of that by doing undo and then undo. All right. So now there's other lever systems in the body. A second class lever system is when you have an axis of rotation, and then you have an external resistance force or reactive force that's happening closer to the axis of rotation than the muscle force provided. All right, and I'll show you an example of a second class lever. So here's a second class lever system, all right? And what you have is you have the muscular force, all right? The resistance force is the axis of rotation. If I'm on my tippy toes, the axis of rotation is the ball of my foot, or the second metatarsal joint. I'm going up on my tippy toes, all right? Now, I have a force that is creating that plantar flexion, my plantar flexion, and that's going to be my calf firing. And my calf is firing and attaches all the way back here at the very back end, the very back of my heel. So that force can't get any further away from the axis of rotation. And that force, when that muscle contracts, is going to shorten this length, and it's going to pull my foot up into toe point. But then I have the force of my body weight, acting through the foot. And that's going to act in between the force of my gastrosoleus unit and the axis of rotation, which is my toe. All right. So just like on a wheelbarrow, all right, you have the muscular forces happening here at the handle, pulling upwards. And I have the resistance force of all of the weight of all the coal pulling downwards, and the axis of rotation. So the torque associated with the resistance here, because the resistance force is happening much closer to the axis of rotation than this muscular force, the torque associated with this resistance, although the force associated is much more, the overall torque is less, because this muscular force is acting at a greater distance away from the axis of rotation. So the torque that I can produce by lifting up on the handle, because the handle is further away from the axis, the torque that I can produce is overall much greater than the torque associated with this resistance. And because the torque is greater at my hand than it is associated with the resistance, a smaller force, so the force associated with these rocks might be pretty big. It might be 100 pounds, say, just to come up with an easy number. And if this resistance force is acting at 1 foot away, that's 100 units of force multiplied by 1 unit of distance away is 100 newtons, or 100 units of torque. But if this force is 50 pounds and the distance away is, say, 3 units away, then 50 times 3 is 150. I can provide 150 units of torque in this direction, whereas I only need to overcome 100 units of torque going downwards. And because this force, this muscular force, is acting at a pretty big distance away associated, compared to this resistance force, I can provide more torque, and that's why it results in a rotation upwards, even though this particular amount of rocks is producing a huge force downwards. What a second-class lever system does is it takes advantage of the fact that the muscular force is acting at a greater distance away than the resistance force. In this situation here, you have a muscular force associated with the gastrocsoleus unit that is contracting at a greater distance away than the force of the body weight, or the force associated with body weight. And because of that, it takes relatively small contraction to fire and put the body up on toe point than it does. And that contraction of the muscle is far less forceful than the actual weight of the body. The drawback of a second-class lever system, though, is I have to lift the weight this distance off of the ground, and it's only going to result in that much change in distance of the rocks. All right, so I have to lift through a greater arc length, and I'm not going to get a huge return in terms of how high the body is going to raise. So for instance, I might have to contract the soleus gastrocsoleus unit this much, but I'm only going to go up on tippy toe this much. So the contraction or the motion of the force is always going to be a greater motion than the result of that particular change in length. All right. So for instance, I'm only going to get the if I go on my toes, no matter how hard and how much I contract my gastroc, I mean, when you go on a toe point, like I'm in toe point right now, and I'm only able to lift my heel about 2 inches off the ground, but my gastrocsoleus unit is contracting over 4 inches. So the motion of the muscle is always going to be greater than the resulting movement that the muscle occurs. The benefit of a second-class lever system is the fact that this distance here is always, or this distance here is always going to be greater than this distance here. Because this distance associated with the muscular force is greater, I can always produce a greater torque with a second-class lever system. The drawback is in range of motion. For every amount or length that I move the muscle, the resultant motion is going to be far less in the external force that I'm trying to lift. So there's a benefit and a drawback. In terms of a first-class lever system, I don't really think that there's a huge drawback. All right, with this lever system here, there's not a huge drawback. If the system isn't balanced, all right, if the system isn't balanced, then there's a drawback, because instead of using balance to hold the head up, I have to fire more forcefully with my neck extensor muscles. So there's not a huge drawback unless there isn't balance with a first-class lever system. With a second-class lever system, the benefit is the muscular force, the force of the gastrocsoleus unit, is acting at a greater distance away from the axis of rotation and can create a greater torque than the resistance force. The drawback is that my gastrocsoleus unit is going to have to fire through a greater range of contraction than the resistance force is going to raise, and that's a drawback. All right. Then the last force lever system that we have is a third-class lever system. So a third-class lever system is when the muscular force is acting at a greater distance away, is acting at a closer distance rather to the axis of rotation than the resistance force. And if that's the case here, then this distance here multiplied by this force here is going to create a torque that's going to create some type of rotation in that direction. The problem here is that this distance associated with the R, look at how much longer it is. So the resistance force here is going to create much greater torque potentially. So an example of that is here. So this is a third class lever system, all right? Let me get rid of these. So you have your bicep tendon. Your bicep tendon is firing in this direction here, like that, in that direction. All right, the axis of rotation is here. So here, if we had to talk about your, let me go like that. I'll end up changing colors. This right here, the distance between the axis of rotation, and I'll even go like this, right? I'll take this and make a new line, and I'll make a new line this color. This right here is if I take that line of force and I extend it all the way down, all the way down, all the way down here. Technically, this length right here, and I know there's lots of lines, but this length right here is the moment arm. It's the perpendicular distance, that's a 90-degree angle between the axis of rotation and the line of force. And I'll draw this out for you so you can understand what I'm talking about. In any event, this distance here multiplied by the muscular force is going to create an amount of torque. But no doubt, this distance here associated with the resistance force is going to be much bigger than that moment arm. So you have the resistance force pulling downwards, all right, creating a force, and that force right here is multiplied by this distance right here. This force here multiplied by this distance is going to create torque yellow. And because the distance is so great, even though the force of the coffee cup that I'm holding in my hand isn't that much, because the distance is pretty great away from this axis of rotation, there's actually a pretty big torque associated with the coffee cup. Now, this force in my muscle force is combining with that red moment arm, and that's also creating a torque, and that torque is the muscular torque, all right? The torque here, boom. Now, the drawback of a third-class lever system, the drawback is the fact that this muscular force is acting at such a close distance to the, is acting at such a close distance to the axis of rotation compared to this distance right here. This distance is much bigger. All right, but the benefit now is, and I'm going to try to erase all this stuff. Let's erase all this stuff. The benefit now is if my bicep fires, say for instance, this far, if my bicep tendon fires that far, it's going to result in my hand moving this far. Like if my arm starts here, and my arm moves from there to here, all right, from there to there, my bicep tendon is only going to fire in that much distance, and it's going to result in my hand moving in that distance, all right, because it's rotating. And a rotation is when these distances might be different, but this angle here, that theta, is the same theta as the theta that my hand moves. Because of that, your body has many third-class levers. The benefit of a third-class lever is the angle at which the distance at which my muscle fires creates a much greater distance change in what's called the end effector. The hand is the end effector. It's the thing that this bicep tendon is actually changing the distance of, or changing the kinematics of, right? When my bicep fires, it only has to fire a matter of centimeters, and that centimeters of firing is going to result in my hand raising 1.5 feet of arc length. That's a huge benefit of a first, and now this is another example of a third-class lever. Here you have the resistance force is acting at a great distance away from the axis of rotation. So although it's creating a lot of torque, in order for me to get my paddle to go from there to here, my hand only has to go from there to there. So a third-class lever system is actually taking advantage of the fact that I don't have to move my muscles through as large of a range in order to get my hand or the end effector to move through a great range of motion. So you have drawbacks and benefits of each of these things. The drawback of a second class lever is, and we got to be done in a second, so I realize I'm going over, but the drawback of a second class lever is I have to move the muscle such a great range of motion compared, and let me erase all this stuff. I have to move my muscle through such a great range of motion in order to lift up the body such a small amount. The benefit of the second class lever system is that I get this distance associated with the force, so I can create a lot of torque. The benefit of a third class lever is that it's associated with like range of motion. Although there's a small torque associated with the muscular force, small motions in the muscle result in large motions of the limb. Imagine if we didn't have third class lever systems, right? You'd have to have huge contractual ranges of motion and it would result in small motions. Now you would say the drawback here is that this force acts pretty close to the axis of rotation. But then again, when are you ever lifting anything that has a resistance that's more than like a book? Right? We don't have to lift huge resistances with our human body. So it benefits us to have more third class lever systems and take advantage of movement. And if I ever do have to lift a resistance that's huge, why don't I just use a wheelbarrow and take advantage of second class lever systems? The last thing that I would say about it is, if I did say, for instance, have a third class lever, this is a third class lever. This is an axis of rotation, then a muscular force, and then a resistance. If I take this and I move the bicep tendon to like say towards the end of my wrist, and my bicep now looks something like this, right? And it attaches to my wrist here, you would think, well, that would give me such a greater range, such a greater distance here associated with the axis of, the lever arm and the moment arm of the bicep. So why don't our biceps look like that? Well, because over time, what happened is if, say, for instance, an animal wanted to take this arm and completely disable it, all it would have to do is bite, right, my bicep and rip my bicep off, and then I wouldn't be able to use this arm anymore. I wouldn't be able to hunt and gather. So what happened is slowly but surely, probably this bicep tendon started and moved, or has evolved to attach as close to this bone as possible. So now if an animal bites the bicep, it's most likely going to bite the bone as well. And the solidness of the bone is going to protect the bicep from being torn off and that limb being now not usable. All right, so evolution has made it so that this bicep tendon insertion is as close to the bone as possible, but still providing for a moment arm and a distance. So when the bicep fires, this force here, provided with this distance here, is always going to result in a rotation. And there are drawbacks because this distance is pretty short, which limits how much I'm going to be able to lift at the hand. But again, human beings have become really good at utilizing tools like first and second class lever systems to be able to overcome the shortfalls of my musculoskeletal anatomy. All right, so I think that's probably where we can go today. It's 10:41. I know that's 20 minutes too long, but I love teaching, so I'm not in a huge rush to get off. If you guys have to get off the call, I get you. That's fine with me. I'm going to just keep recording everything, and I'll probably just post it tonight. If you have any questions, give me a call, right? 617-285-0406. All right, hope you have a good day. Love you.
We'll go.
All right, you too, Joe, Jose. You two guys, be good. What up, Emily? What up, John? What up, Jose?